This lecture will cover the great explosion of revivalism in the West during the 18th century and how that led to the birth and expansion of Protestant missionary activity in the global world. While there's an important parallel story of Roman Catholic missionary activity during the 17th and 18th century, the majority of this lecture will concentrate on Protestant efforts to make converts and to expand the church. In many ways, the remarkable atmosphere of revivalism that descended on Britain and America during the 18th and 19th centuries was a reaction to the Enlightenment. And there's a handout for this week's material that covers the Enlightenment in some detail that I encourage you to read. The Enlightenment was an influential movement of ideas that began around 1648 and continued till around the 1790s. It advanced a number of different ideas that varied from country to country and from time to time as the Enlightenment went on. At the heart of Enlightenment thinking, however, was the nature and role of reason. Reason was now elevated over revelation, that is, over Scripture, as a means of obtaining objective truth. That doesn't mean the Enlightenment was atheistic in nature. It wasn't, though some leading exponents of it, especially in France, were atheists. This was just a different way of looking at men and women's role in the created order. In one of its most advanced forms, the Enlightenment elevated human ability to solve all the problems of life, problems like poverty, war and violence, inequality, illness, and even death. Central to this was the concept of progress. That is, society and humankind overall are progressing towards a better world. To be sure, technology played a large part in this, but progress was not always due to technological gains. Another central concept was individualism and individual autonomy. That is, the church was no longer essential to salvation, in particular the Roman Catholic Church. Each individual must now determine for himself or herself what Christian belief is and what it is not. Moreover, these liberated individuals no longer needed God or others. They are autonomous. The church was not immune to the influence of the Enlightenment. In general, Protestant spirituality now became more rational, intellectual, distant, and cold. In response to this atmosphere, two separate but related movements arose: Pietism and Evangelicalism. Pietism emerged from the Lutheran Church in Germany. It was a movement of spiritual renewal within that church. It was not a new denomination, and it served to counter the rationalism of the Enlightenment. In short, the insights and passions of the 16th century Protestant reformers had now cooled. Rationalism had set in. The Pietists countered this influence by encouraging the church to recall the importance of various spiritual principles, including conversion and new birth, personal faith in Jesus Christ, the warmth of Christian experience as a spur to effective mission. In addition to its influence in renewing the church, Pietism also stimulated a missionary concern. The missionary work, centered at Herrnhut in Germany, pictured here, became the first major Protestant missionary effort, covering or extending to many parts of the globe. In 1734, Pietism came to America through the influence of Moravian immigration to Georgia and later to Pennsylvania. As its name suggests, Pietism concentrated on the practice of piety rooted in the inner experience of the believer and expressing itself in the life of religious commitment. The three principal characteristics of Pietism were, first, to speak out against abuses in the church. Second, to stress practical and personal holiness. And three, to emphasize a living, experiential faith. The most influential theological work of Pietism was Philip Spainer's Pia Desideria, or Pious Desires, published in 1675. Spener observed that there was now a lack of true living faith in the Church, as the result mostly of the Enlightenment. The clergy, he argued, failed to understand and practice true Christianity. They possessed no true marks of new birth or earnest inner goodness, and they stressed disputation and controversy, especially in preaching. Their cool, distant scholastic theology placed reason over illumination and provided no effective pastoral care and catechism. The clergy were also criticized for being paid to grant absolution. That is, the clergy were paid by the state and effectively, therefore, paid to grant absolution of sins to people. More positively, he suggested that devotional practices for prayer, Bible reading, and so forth should be instituted. The priesthood of all believers should be emphasized. Orthodox Lutheran doctrine should be upheld, and schism should be discouraged. Greater use of Scripture, both privately and in small groups, should be emphasized. Love must be acted on, for example, maintaining proper conduct in religious controversies, setting a good example, and avoiding offense. He emphasized that Christian union is gained through holiness of life. Therefore, a focus on piety and holy living, combined with seminary study, is needed. Piety, however, must be practiced as well as studied. Finally, sermons should aim at the spiritual needs of the inner person and promote a living knowledge of effective Christianity. In the English-speaking world, a series of closely connected revivals broke out during the early 18th century. These included revivals in Wales, England, Scotland, Ireland, and colonial America, in roughly that chronological order. These revivals were aimed at church and personal revival, to counter the cool and rational effects of the Enlightenment. Now, there's a connection between the revivals and Pietism. The direct connection is through John Wesley, who was intimately involved in advancing the revivals. Wesley met Moravian missionaries on his way to Georgia when Wesley was going as a missionary. And while they the boat they were in came into a big storm, Wesley feared for his life. But the Moravians were calm, trusting, prayerful, singing, and Wesley was really drawn into their spirituality and remained so for many years to come. And when Wesley got back to London, he went through something like a second conversion experience after meeting with a group of Moravians in London. And Wesley commented on this very famously, saying, "My heart was strangely warmed," which is a really an antithetical version of what the Enlightenment does with its coolness and distance. So the two groups, Pietism and Revivalism, the two movements, if you will, were closely related, with a lot of contacts between the two groups. And there were close connections between the revivals themselves. This is because of travel and communication. Through travel, the leaders of the revival took their message from place to place. John Wesley, for example, traveled extensively around Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and England, as well as colonial America. George Whitefield, though English, spent much of his adult life as a missionary and leading exponent of the revival to colonial America. Through the Missionary Center at Herrnhut, letters went out to various parts of the world where early Protestant missionaries were working, communicating news of revival in one place and then another. This encouraged the missionaries and kept them up to date on what was occurring in distant lands. It also enabled them to communicate with each other on best practices. Early on, they were known as Methodist, though they were clergy of the Church of England. Their movement grew quickly, attracting large crowds. Why? First of all, because the revival advanced a rich, authentic, and heartfelt spiritual alternative to the cool, rational, reasoned spirituality of the Enlightenment. Secondly, it also afforded unique and valuable opportunities for women to exercise spiritual leadership in the church through preaching, teaching, writing, administrative leadership, or spiritual guidance. A significant number of Anglican clergy were influenced by the revival and began preaching its doctrines and advancing its causes in their church and in society itself. Soon, the revival established a foothold at Oxford and Cambridge, where it influenced the future leaders of the nation. It also attracted a number of wealthy aristocrats, both men and women, as well as a number of wealthy merchants from the new, rapidly expanding middle classes. Thus, by the close of the 18th century, some 60 years after its beginnings, the evangelical revival had become perhaps the most influential religious party in the Church of England. Of some importance, it had done much to halt the spirit of Enlightenment-inspired rationalism in England and America, and, as we will see, it established a foundation for extensive missionary efforts throughout many parts of the world. There were four principal characteristics of the theology of the evangelical revival. These were conversionism, or the belief that lives needed to be changed. Secondly, activism, or the expression of the gospel in effort. Third, biblicism, or a high regard for the authority of Scripture. And fourth, crucicentrism, or an emphasis on the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. But it was a theology of the heart as well as the head. The influence of pietism can be seen in its emphasis on religious experience and passion, the authority of Scripture, and on activism. The influence of the Enlightenment, on the other hand, can be seen in its individualistic nature, that is, in its emphasis on individual conversion, on the need for a personal relationship with Christ. Most evangelicals were moderate Calvinism, like George Whitefield, though there were some prominent Arminians, such as John and Charles Wesley. The revival also influenced other denominations, that is, those outside the Church of England, especially the Methodist, Congregationalist, and Baptist. One of the most important characteristics or features of the revival was the so-called Clapham sect, a group of men and women of talent, means, worldly connections, and spiritual determination. Many of them lived, and this is how they acquired their name, around the village of Clapham, south of London. Their most famous member was William Wilberforce, brilliant, talented, a gifted parliamentary speaker, well connected in society, and wealthy. His many parliamentary accomplishments included the abolition of the slave trade in the worldwide British Empire, at a time when the empire controlled the vast majority of the slave trade in the world. It also included the abolition of the practice of slavery itself. The abolition of the slave trade took place in 1807, and the abolition of the practice of slavery in the empire took place in 1833. Another prominent member was Thomas Clarkson, who worked tirelessly for the abolition of the slave trade. Another was Henry Thornton, a politician, abolitionist, merchant, banker, and philanthropist who gave generously of his time, talent, influence, and money to advance the gospel. Hannah More was an influential author and religious activist who established the first women's savings banks in England. She hired teachers to teach poor women to read and write, and others to help them acquire a trade. She established schools for poor children. labored tirelessly to enact abolition, and she wrote novels and shorter works. She was, in fact, so popular and influential that her novels outsold those of her contemporary, Jane Austen, during her lifetime. Charles Simeon was a Cambridge academic and clergyman who dedicated his life to influencing generations of young undergraduates. He became an influential mentor to numerous evangelical leaders. John Newton was a former slave trader who, after surviving a violent storm at sea, had a dramatic conversion experience. He was then ordained as a clergyman and later helped direct the abolitionist movement. He's best known for his hymn, Amazing Grace, perhaps the most often sung and beloved hymn in all of history. Thomas Scott was a clergyman and notable biblical scholar. Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon, spent her vast fortune to support Wesley and Whitefield and a host of other evangelical clergy. She also established the first Methodist seminary in England, which was actually in Wales, and she built and endowed a number of new churches throughout England. The rise of evangelicalism in England coincided with the rapid expansion of the British Empire during the 18th and 19th centuries. And so when we now speak of Christianity as a global faith, it was the pietists of the 18th century and the English evangelicals of the 19th, both having sponsored extensive missionary activities, who were largely responsible for this development. Anglicanism, the third largest Christian tradition in the world with some 80 million members, is principally evangelical in nature throughout Africa, Asia, and a number of parts of the world. The two largest Anglican provinces are both evangelical in nature, Nigeria with about 18 million Anglicans, and Uganda with about 8 million. Evangelical missionaries from other countries or other parts of the British Isles, English, Welsh, Scottish, and their denominations also made extensive progress throughout the world during the 19th century, including Presbyterian ministries in the U.S., Canada, Australia, and more recently in Korea. The First Great Awakening in colonial America, as it's called, led to several subsequent Great Awakenings that influenced religious life in America throughout the 19th century. In short, as America expanded westward, revivalism was always just a half step behind. Thus, the American frontier was settled by strong men and women, but also by religious revivals. Especially notable was its influence among the Baptists and the Methodists. Let me just take a moment to explain this. The Baptists had a wonderful ecclesiology for expanding with the westward immigration, if you will, across North America, because the Baptists don't need to ask permission from anybody to start a church. Basically, when 2 or 3 are gathered, you can start a church and call it a Baptist church, and you're ready to go. The Methodists had a little bit of a different polity, but nevertheless effective. With Methodism, you did need to get permission, but not as hierarchical as some denominations. But what the Methodists did brilliantly was they had this thing called the circuit rider. And the circuit rider would be based in one spot, and he would do a circle around a certain geographic area over the course of, say, several weeks. And he would come in and evangelize and convert people, and then encourage them to start a fellowship of their own. And then he'd leave and go to the next place and do the same. And then he'd come back a few weeks later to see how they're doing and to build them up and that. And both of these church polities or approaches to ecclesiology were really brilliantly adapted to the expansion of the American frontier. The last thing to say about this is that the spirit or the tradition of revivalism has left a profound mark on American spirituality. In a long succession of revivalists stretching from George Whitefield all the way to Billy Graham. The global expansion of Christianity has been one of the most significant developments in the history of the Church. This expansion, the, quote, next Christendom, as Philip Jenkins has called it, came about because of missionary activity during the 19th and 20th centuries. The modern age has provided unprecedented opportunities and challenges for advancing Jesus' Great Commission. These included the use of numerous technological advances, for example, radio, television, and the internet, the easing of restrictions on travel and immigration, and an increase in global and cross-cultural awareness. Finally, as the center of Christianity has shifted from Europe and America to Asia, Africa, and Latin America during the late 20th century, so too has Christian missionary activity. Missionaries are now being sent from Korea, Nigeria, and elsewhere to Europe and North America. There's really two reasons for this. First of all, to serve as pastors to immigrants from their own countries, given that the churches that they belong to back home advanced a more evangelical and often much more warm understanding of the gospel. And secondly, to evangelize Westerners and to counter the secularization that's going on in so much of the West. During the 16th century, Catholic missionaries, inspired by the Counter-Reformation, accompanied Spanish and Portuguese explorers on their voyages to Africa, India, Asia, and Latin America, where virtually millions of native people were converted to Catholicism, admittedly not always peacefully. But surprisingly, many of these new converts retained aspects of their traditional beliefs, for example, ancestor worship, and these practices continue in some places today. Until the 18th century, missionary activity was dominated by the Catholic Church. Protestants were then engaged in organizing and defending themselves, and wrestling over minute points of theology. All that was about to change, however. It's estimated that during the 19th century alone, there were over 8 million converts to Catholicism in the developing world. At the same time, however, Protestant missionaries were becoming increasingly active. In England, this was led by the Corporation for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England, which was founded in 1649. More influential was the establishment of the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, or the SPCK, founded a few years later in 1698, and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, or the SPG, founded in 1701. These missionary societies sent over 300 missionaries to the American colonies during the 18th century. Around the same time, Britain was establishing the largest empire the world had ever known, which would eventually include more than a quarter of the world's population. This proved an unprecedented opportunity for missionary work in places where Christianity was little known. The importance of England's contribution to the advancement of missionary endeavor throughout the world during this time can hardly be exaggerated. Another Protestant missionary effort was led by the German pietist. During the early years of the 18th century, the King of Denmark turned to the University of Halle in Germany, which was then the center of pietism, for missionaries to send to Danish territories in India. They were to serve not as chaplains to the Danes in India, but as missionaries to the native population. He was supported in this by the English SPCK. The king enlisted 2 students to travel to India, where they landed in July of 1706. These 2 were among the first Protestant foreign missionaries in history. As we have seen, another early source of Protestant missionary activity was established by the German pietist community at Herrnhut. In 1727, they began a 24/7 prayer watch that continued nonstop for over 100 years, praying for the work of evangelism and mission. Beginning in 1732, they sent over 300 foreign missionaries around the world, supported by these prayers. In 1735, a group of pietist or Moravian missionaries met John Wesley, the founder of Methodism in England, on a voyage to North America, and through their influence, both Wesley and Methodism were transformed and forged important links with German Pietist influence. The Methodist Missionary Society was then founded in 1786 and became another source of overseas missionaries. The establishment in England of the Baptist Missionary Society occurred in 1792. In the following year, it sent William Carey to India, an event often described as the commencement of the modern missionary movement. I find this a strikingly Protestant historical perspective, given the long centuries of Catholic missionary activity that preceded it. The founding of a number of additional Protestant societies and organizations soon follow, each influenced by the evangelical revival in England. These included the London Missionary Society in 1795, the Church Missionary Society in 1799, the British and Foreign Bible Society in 1804, and the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews in 1809. As foreign missionary work expanded even further during the 19th century, several more specialized organizations were established, including the South American Missionary Society in 1844, the Melanesian Mission in 1846, the University Mission to Central Africa in 1859. Another important initiative was inspired by the evangelistic campaigns in England of the American revivalist Dwight L. Moody. The largest of these was the China Inland Mission, launched in 1865 by Hudson Taylor. This work later became the model for the interdenominational or faith type of missionary work. Despite this remarkable legacy of foreign missionary accomplishment in England, or emerging from England, which was financed by voluntary donations to mission societies, during the early 20th century, leadership of the missionary movement shifted to America. The origins of missionary activity in America can be traced to Williams College in Massachusetts in the early 19th century, arising out of the Second Great Awakening. Samuel J. Mills drew together a group of his fellow students at Williams who had a great desire to take the gospel to foreign lands. In August of 1808, returning from one of their regular prayer meetings, they were caught in a thunderstorm. Taking refuge in a haystack, they vowed to God and each other to take the gospel to foreign lands. This marked the beginning of the famous haystack movement. The students offered themselves to the Congregationalists, who formed the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Mission, or the ABC-FM, in the year 1810, and quickly began seeking support from other Protestant denominations. The first American missionaries were ordained in the Congregational Church and sent out in February of 1812, the most famous of whom was Adoniram Judson. The first Protestant missionaries arrived in Hawaii in 1820, sent by the ABC-FM. Others arrived 2 years later from London, sent by the London Missionary Society. Students continued to make important contributions to the missionary movement in America. The most important of these was the Student Voluntary Movement, or SVM, founded in 1886 under the inspiration of Dwight Moody at Mount Hermon, Massachusetts. Another important contributor to the SVM was the tireless Methodist lay leader John R. Mott, who became head of the movement in 1888 at age 23. Between 1888 to 1920, the SVM sent more than 25,000 university graduates from America to the overseas mission field. In 1895, Mott created the World's Student Christian Federation, and he chaired the important World Missionary Conference at Edinburgh in 1910. Mott's view of missionary activity was expressed in the watchword of the movement and the title of his famous book. The Evangelization of the World in This Generation, published in 1900. This modernistic-inspired optimism was shared by many in the American church and in the wider Western society. The peak of the SVM was reached in 1921, when 637 college graduates were called to the foreign mission field. After that, the atmosphere quickly changed. The famous watchword was soon dropped, and interest in social issues replaced evangelicalism with many students. The fundamentalist modernist controversies of the 1920s also contributed to this decline. By 1934, only 38 graduates departed for overseas missions. The influence of the local church was also an important component in American missionary work. Without state aid for the church, as in Europe, it was the local church that provided the means necessary. Women also played an essential role in the early missionary movement. At first, only single men were sent out as foreign missionaries. Many people considered it too dangerous and difficult, and even improper, to send women to foreign and so-called primitive countries as missionaries. Later, as views began to change, married men were sent out as foreign missionaries, with their wives accompanying them. Not infrequently, missionaries died while on the mission field. When this happened, their wives either returned to America or, not infrequently, just continued on with the work of running the mission, sometimes with, and sometimes without, the permission of their church or missionary board back home. Overall, these women did exceptionally well in these efforts. Finally, single women became eligible for serving as foreign missionaries, but this took time to become accepted. Even today, this practice remains controversial among some. The overseas mission field was thus one of the first and most important areas in Christianity where women's leadership and gifts were publicly expressed. Denominations weren't as important on the mission field as they were back home. Here, the gospel needed to be communicated simply and directly, not loaded with denominational nuance. Consequently, much ecumenical understanding and cooperation developed on the mission field. Hence, the missionary movement proved invaluable in paving the way for the formal emergence of the ecumenical movement following World War II. The United States' contribution to the overseas missionary movement has been described by the Yale historian Kenneth LaTourette as, quote, the greatest voluntary outpouring of life and treasure ever seen to spread the gospel to all the peoples of the world. Well, why did he say this? Why did he claim such a thing? Well, since the 1920s, American Protestants have made up the largest overseas missionary force in the world. During the second half of the 20th century, Americans represented about 60% of all Protestant missionaries serving overseas. The numbers are revealing. By the 1870s, there were no more than a few hundred American missionaries serving overseas. By 1890, this had increased to 900. 10 years later, it increased to 5,000. And within 5 years past that, it had doubled to 10,000. By 1925, there were more than 13,000 American overseas missionaries. Within this, a number of missionary societies and boards were established in the U.S. in similar fashion to those in England earlier. The Foreign Mission Conference of North America was established in 1893, and it quickly came to include most of the earlier ones. By 1925, around 80% of American missionaries were associated with it. The first thing to say about this missionary activity is that we would not be discussing the global church today had it not been for the remarkable service and sacrifice of the many thousands of overseas missionaries during the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Kenneth Scott LaTourette, again the famous Yale historian, has written extensively about the expansion of Christianity. He described the 19th century as, quote, the great century for foreign missions. There are more people living today who are Christians than the combined number of Christians that lived from the time of Jesus to the end of the Second World War. But of course, world population also keeps expanding. And so, as a percentage of world population, Christianity is roughly keeping pace. Because of the modern missionary movement, spiritual revival has characterized much of the religious life of South America, Africa, Asia, and even America since the mid-20th century. Given the important shift in the leadership of world Christianity from the north to the south, scholars now speak of Christianity as a global movement, not as a Western one. This rapid and vast expansion of Christianity has been the direct result of the modern missionary movement. Its legacy has literally changed the religious nature of the world.